All right, a major act is in town for 2 days doing rehearsals before they start a European tour. I've got 2, possibly 3 amps to fix in about a day and a half. This is the main SVT. I'm about to open it up and I'll tell you about the issues as we discover them. The other one's a Magnatone, and if I'm able to get this one fixed in time, there's a second SVT. Both are the VR series. So let me open this up and we'll resume. Little pro tip for you. Sorry if I sound weird today. My world has become pollen. But if you remove the corner protectors, it's much easier to get everything apart, including this little front panel that just Velcroed in place. I've already loosened these a little bit with a number 2 screwdriver handheld. Now that I know that they're not cross-threaded or anything, I can use the power tool to get them out. I've already pulled the power section. Well, you'll get to see all that in a minute. But when it's up on its side like this, things are much less likely to fall over and fall down, and there's no pressure in places you don't want pressure. So at this point, you should be able to slide the preamp out and that little board. When the corner protectors are in place, it traps the bottom of the board. It can damage the chassis, and it makes pulling the main power amp and the metal grill in the back out just about impossible. All right, this amp has brand new 6550s, I believe. Yeah, that were installed about a month ago by a friend of mine who's an excellent tech. And it has some older work, I believe, that doesn't look like it was done by his shop. So we've got a combination of things. I see some not great looking solder joints in here. Before I power it on, I want to check some voltages just to make sure there's nothing really nasty waiting for me in case I need to touch anything, because SVTs hold an awful lot of nasties waiting to get you if you're not careful. So chassis ground. Nah, it's just holding about 4 volts. I know the amp makes sound and powers up safely, so I can skip some of my usual stuff. Let me turn on my outlets, leave it in standby, power it on, and I'm going to watch the output tubes, make sure they all heat up. All right, I see one that may not have a glow, and that could explain the weird sounds. I've got to move the camera out of my way to peer down and see. Sometimes it's harder to see a tube glow than others. Let me check on that. No, they're all glowing, not an issue. Yeah, things I like to check. All right, I'm gonna take it out of standby. I've got both channel volumes off. All right, hear that? And the bias is flashing in time with it. So I think before I do anything else, I'm going to check some of those solder joints that don't look so great. Any one of those could be the cause. And this does not mean that my friend's shop missed something. This amp has traveled a few thousand miles since it was last on their bench, and many things can go wrong with an SVT. Classic, VR, the new Heritage, they all share the same output construction and have the same potential drawbacks. So I'm going to reflow everything that I think needs to be reflowed and then try this again. And if that's not the fix, at least I will know that a lot of stuff is better, and then I can narrow it down to other stuff. But that is the sound of something charging and discharging, and sounds like an arc to me, as if there's not a good connection somewhere. So stay tuned. All right, I don't have time to show all these, but I'll show you the principle. This is one of the main filter caps. Those are some really crappy looking solder joints there. So I heat the old stuff up, suck out most of it. I'll do this one as well at the same time. And then I get in there with some braid, which gets the stuff that the sucker doesn't really get very well. And I've confirmed that there is no voltage being stored on these caps, and it is unplugged from the wall. So get as much of this old lead-free stuff out as possible, because it was not giving us good connections. And I reflow. Sometimes the old stuff in there bubbles up to the top. Those look much better. I'm also suspicious of these ground connections here. Let me undo one of them for you. There's screw here. And it goes into a standoff, which is metal, which is tied to chassis for ground. And it's got a little bit of Loctite or some other adhesive on there to make sure it doesn't come loose. But beneath that, it's supposed to be contacting the chassis ground point, which is that shiny stuff, through that black oxide washer. But sometimes that adhesive stuff gets in there between the two and prevents good contact from metal to metal. And it's all embedded in this. And I'm just not confident that that's making a good connection. So I'm going to break that heat, break that glue with some heat. And get that off there. I want that to, the adhesive is fine in its own way, but it doesn't make for good solder and grounds. And if this thing's about to go on the road in Europe and abroad in general, probably do a lot of tours of duty. I want to get as much of that nasty adhesive out so we have good metal to metal contact. And then I will vibration proof that connection with some clear acrylic, which does not hold quite as well as the Loctite, but it will not soak in as much between the layers and prevent a good ground. So let me clean that washer off really well and make sure that's going to be good contact, and I'll put it all together. Actually, I decided to toss that little black oxide washer. It's a stainless compression washer. No Loctite or other adhesive necessary. That's not going to go anywhere, and that's good metal to metal contact. That's going to be a much better ground. All right, after resoldering all those suspicious joints, that noise is gone, the bias is steady, sound seems all right. I'm going to let this sit for about 20 minutes and make sure the bias stays stable through that period. And then I'll test it at a little bit higher volume with a bass. That fluctuation you see there, that's pretty normal as the tubes warm up. You don't set the final bias when the amp's only been on 5-10 minutes. So I'm not too concerned about that. But I will be watching it in case something sporadic happens or if that noise returns. But I think they just had a bad solder joint. I don't think the solder joints are in question or by my friend's shop, but they weren't a problem when it was on my friend's bench. If you want to see me make that go away, there it is. And I'll also do the hum adjust and all that fun stuff. Well, it's been on about 20 minutes now, and it sounds really good. It's been stable. I don't think it's going to have any problems. We put it all back together, give it another final playing test, and then move to the second of 3 amps. All buttoned up, seems just fine. That ought to work. Next up is this Magnatone Varsity Reverb that's making this awful buzz. Sounds like a bad ground or something. And it's doing this at a very low volume. The channel volume's on like 9 o'clock because they're, it's a big tour thing, then they're using in-ears. So these are used as tone generators more than amplifiers. So this thing should be dead quiet at this volume. And let's see what it takes to get it back to where it ought to be. A more useful view for you guys at home. Noise goes away when the reverb's turned off. So let's start with the tank rather than the amp. It's the same Accutronics belt-in tank that fails in just about every amp that's used in these days. These are just terrible. I've got some gaffer tape holding the tank to a bit of cardboard. I'll try to preserve that gaffer tape. If not, I have similar stuff in my arsenal. All right, this originally had the Quick Connect press-ons. Someone has soldered this, bypassing the Quick Connect, but that blue wire broke there and at this end. So all mysteries explained. It's a standard tank to use in a Fender with reverb. So I will get him something better, and let me see what my options are quickly. They may want me to overnight something better than this. Well, I had pulled the rear cover to make sure this had the correct 2-amp fuse in here before it went back, because it needs to go out on the road, and they opted for just another Accutronics tank to save time and money. I did that, but when I took the rear panel off so I could verify this fuse holder, because it's not the kind with the thumb wheel, you just really can't change it out easily unless you put it upside down with the rear cover on. So I took the rear cover off to change this, and I saw this discoloration on these JJ EL84s. They are toasted. This was red not long ago. You can see some reds remaining, and then it's all gray. And the chassis had gotten really hot while the amp was in use. So I need to see what they're doing as far as bias on this. Yeah, I did the calculations. This thing is idling at 15 watts, 14.9 watts right now per tube. That's way over what they're rated for, and the tubes just aren't going to last. That's with the wall voltage at 122 right now, which is not even as hot as it often gets, as high as it normally gets in Memphis. So that resistor, this resistor here is the cathode bias resistor. That needs to be increased. Let me call the tech for the band, explain why and what I need, what I want to do, why I need to do it, and that it needs a new pair of EL84s. And this is one of 2 of these Magnatone Varsity reverbs they're using. And odds are, if this one's like this, the other one's like this, or soon will be. So we've got a day and a half left, really just a day, to rectify all this, no pun intended. Let me see what he says. Okay, 150 ohm, 5 watt resistor out, placed with a 200 ohm, 5 watt Vichy. The original was a Zycon. These 2 Zycon 2 or 3 watt 100 ohm screen grid resistors are out. New Vichy 2 watt 1K resistors here for the screens. The Sovtech output tubes, EL84s, should last a lot longer. These JJs are obviously dying. So, Magnatone had their chance to get it right. They did this. So my turn, according to the tech, who agrees with me, who, no one likes to have their amp die in front of 20,000 people. And this was going to do that at some point if this change had not been made. Now, a note about this Magnatone, and I'm not slamming Magnatone, and I don't hate Magnatone, and I'm not angry at Magnatone, blah, 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 blah. I'm not out to get anyone. They have an excessive B+ in these amps for EL84s, specifically the plate to cathode voltage. When the amp came in with 122 wall volts, and the tubes were biased at 14.9 watts each, which is way crazy hot for EL84s to last. The plate to cathode voltage was 355, big difference. 355 volts plate voltage, which is 5 volts over the maximum rating of an EL84 according to the data sheet. Now that I've cooled the bias off to 12.65 watts per tube, which is good, that's the range that you want to be in, 12 to 14 watts, as close to 13 as possible. Sadly, that puts the plate voltage, plate to cathode, at 362 volts DC. So we're 12 volts over the rated maximum of an EL84. Now, Magnatone is not the only company doing this. I have no idea why so many companies are ignoring the data sheets of EL84s. And as a result, owners get EL84s that look like this. Sometimes, like in a Fender Blues Junior, that heat burns the PCB board that the tube sockets are mounted at. Now, this amp has got chassis mounted sockets, nice ceramic chassis mounted sockets. Everything's hand wired in there, blah, blah, blah. This is a very different price point. So this punishes the owner of this amp by making them have a guy like me say, what was Magnatone thinking? Changing 3 resistors and they get a new pair of output tubes. But it punishes those who can't afford a Magnatone or other nice amp by saying, oh, well, they can't afford a nice amp, so let's make their amp catch on fire. It really ticks me off that those with the least amount of money, the smallest budgets, get punished disproportionately by these companies that do this kind of thing. And if you, had scrimped and saved to get this Magnatone and it kills your output tubes again and again and again, that's not right. So if I were designing this app, the first thing I would do is say, what is the data sheet max for EL84s? Let's make sure that if I exceed that, it's not by a lot, and it's very intentional. I run a lot of tests. And yeah, Vox used 100 ohm screen grid resistors, but everyone knows that's nonsense. Let's give it some good screen grids, and let's not idle them above 14 watts per tube. And it's got a GZ34, that's cool, you know. Maybe I'll choose a power transformer that has more current for the rectifier tube, and I'll use a 5U4, and then, you know, that 12 volts, I'm over the max rating on the EL84s, that magically goes away and everything will be great. And I don't know whether the power transformer in this amp can handle a 5U4 rather than the GZ34, because the manual that Magnatone has is crappy, and their website is very good if you want to know all the things that make you want to buy a Magnatone as far as pictures and Billy Gibbons and stuff, but there's no phone number. I assume if you're a dealer, you can get the magic phone number, but I can't call them and say, hey, I got a very good high-profile client going out on the road using your amps, and I'm concerned about the plate to cathode voltage on his EL84s. Can I put a 5U4G in there? So, you know, here I am. Hopefully, even with the 12 volts over the max, now that the output tubes are running cool and the screens have some legitimate protection on them, these tubes will last on the road. Okay, so now I can button this one up and get to the SVT. All right, this amp's been on about 15 minutes. The complaint the players had was that there's a hum, and there is, and that the output sounded really farty on the low end. I think they might both be the same issue, that the bias is not set correctly. And it doesn't matter if it was set correctly a month ago by the previous tech. Tubes drift, SVTs do weird things. You have to check every once in a while. And if the bias is not right, the different sides of the output are drawing different amounts of current. Not only do you have that hum from a loss of common mode cancellation, but you can have a farty low end because it's not going to be pushing at the same amount that it's pulling, so to speak. So let's... All right, that's good. The hum's gone. And that may change again as the amp's on for the first hour. I'll give it some more time to make sure that there's nothing I missed, but let's listen to it and see if there's farty low end. That sounds very correct. Let me turn it up a little bit, but that sounds like a P-bass into an SVT. Let me check the settings. All right, turn the bass up a little bit and the volume up a little bit. I'm almost at 11 o'clock on the volume, which is as loud as I want to go here. I'm running into an 8 ohm dummy load and into my 8 ohm guitar cabinet. So as far as the wattage goes, my speakers should be okay here. And as far as the impedance goes, the amp should be happy at these relatively low volumes. Got a little too much nail on my right hand to really get that to sound right, but it sounded pretty good. I'm going to let this run a little bit longer just to make sure that the bias doesn't start to need to be adjusted further. There is a slight whistle I hear in the background. Let's see if that's affected by the channel volumes. No. Now I don't hear it. So I think I'll need to be tapping on some preamp tubes. They're under the little shell of the front panel control box. So a little bit of microphonics on that tube. Not too bad. Those tube shields, not tube shields, but those metal spring retainers can exacerbate microphonics in these. Doesn't sound like anything that's going to be a problem at volume, but you know, so much of SVT is That sounds pretty good. Let's see how it's doing 30 minutes from now, an hour from now. All right, it's been on about 30 minutes. And remember that whistle? It's now, there's a whistle and a hollow, echoey sound that I can hear through the speaker as I'm talking to you. And the preamp box is on my bench 3 or 4 feet from me. And just the sound of my voice is making it react and vibrate. If I tap on it, and there's a whistle that comes and goes. So that's interesting. Something's extremely microphonic. It's probably a preamp tube. Let's open that up and take a look. All right, down here in the preamp board, I'm not getting that microphonics yet. Interesting. A little bit there. But, you know, it took a while to build up before. I wonder if it's a ribbon cable with a loose connector. That's probably going to be the one right there. I'm being careful not to touch anything other than the tops of these tubes. Let me swap that tube out and see if I can make that problem not come back. It's an old GE 12AU7. I've got some old 12AUs around here. Here's a newish TAD 12AU though. That's even worse, but now this one's also bad. But now it's not worse. Now it seems okay. That's frustrating. Is something else loose and it's cycling with heat? I'm gonna have to get in there and take a look, just a second. All right, well, I found an old, of all things, EI 12AU7, which is not microphonic, in my stash. If you tap on it, you can hear it a little bit, just barely though. Yeah, it's one of those things. I will see if Tube Depot has some good AU7s in stock. I'm sure that they do, that I can pick up in the morning and get this back to the band with 1 or 2 spare AU7s that are not microphonic. So if all that was wrong with this was a AU7 and the bias balance, that's great. But you know, you got to do a lot to make sure on a big, expensive, complicated amp like this before it goes on a world tour. I started this video at 11:30 this morning, and in the first shots you can see there was sunlight coming into the living room in the background. Now you can see it's dark. I'm still going. I went to the studio where the rehearsals are being held and dropped off the first SVT and the first Varsity. And I picked up this Varsity to do the same mods to. This one doesn't have a reverb tank. Apparently this version doesn't have reverb. And he prefers this amp. Probably that's the difference, reverb versus non, in terms of the circuit. This one's got a Celestion Alnico Gold. And we're gonna see if it also needs a bias change. The guitarist said he'd been going through a lot of EL84s on these amps, this one included, which does not surprise me. Really good guitarist, really nice guy. It's not important who, I don't need to name drop. But he was the stunt guitarist, the lead guitarist, the main artist that everyone works for. His amps did not need to leave the studio, I was told. So I brought a bunch of gear and tested them. He had a Vox hand-wired AC30 reissue that had been serviced by a buddy of mine in New York recently. It was fine. He had a 56 or 57, maybe 55. The code on the tube chart was damaged. 5D3 Fender Deluxe Tweed that had been recently serviced by a friend of mine in New York. And I don't need to take these out yet. And I went through it, and all I could find was some dust building up on the output jack, or between the jack and the plug. So I just cleaned all that and made sure everything was tight. That was fine. And he had 2 Fender Deluxe Reverb reissues. And I showed them what I do on those. I opened them up and I showed them the filter caps. His were not leaking. His were very early ones with the larger IC brand caps. And I said that they eventually will. And when they have some scheduled downtime in a major city to get those changed out as well, preventatively. I showed them the heater quick connects in the amp and how to fix that, though they had not caused any problem yet. And I showed them how to check for broken solder joints and to tighten the hardware. And indeed, both those amps have loose hardware and as a result, broken and semi-broken solder joints on input jacks and volume pots and such. So we reflowed all those at the studio, and the artist should be happy. It's one of those things where he may not know that I did anything. He won't be happy that I fixed anything, but he sure would be unhappy with his tech if something went out in the middle of a show in front of however many thousand people. You know, there's just the reality of it. For most people who have made it, I'm a non-entity. I'm crew. The guitarist in his band, though, was very nice and came out to meet me, and we talked about amps for a little bit. So that was a pleasure. And, you know, I'm not shit-talking the main artist. I'm a big fan of his music. It's meant a lot to me over the years, and I'm honored to be here doing this stuff. And I was glad to lay down on the floor and fix some deluxes in kind of an impromptu setting. So let's see where this one ends up biased. It's got the same 150 ohm. This measures 143.1. Power it on. Let this warm up. It's got some static on that pot. Pot needs to be cleaned. It may not be static on that pot. It may be a grid thing or the tube. It's a pretty microphonic tube. We'll look into that in a little while. All right, but I don't want any signal while I do what I'm about to do next. I want it to be at a true idle. And the voltage on that cathode resistor is 12.47. It's with 123 volts coming out of the wall. And the plate to cathode voltage right now is 362, which is higher than the previous amp's plate voltage. So this is idling at 14.86 watts. The previous one in stock form was idling at 14.9 watts. Both are too high. What's intriguing to me is that on the first amp, after I adjusted the bias to get it to 12.65 watts per tube, at that point we had 362 volts plate to cathode, which seemed high to me. This one's higher than that. I wonder if it's the difference is the GZ34. This is a TAD, and these are ARS 12AX7, EL84s, and there's a little bit of discoloration on them. They're probably okay. Let's see how they do once they're cooled off. So again, I'm going to change the bias resistor for 200. I'm going to change these 100 ohm screen grids for some 1K ohms. And then we're going to see about that preamp tube. Okay, all rebiased. The tubes are now idling at 13.09 watts with a plate to cathode voltage of 365.2. That's good. Next up, there's a little bit of noise on that volume when the negative feedback is lifted. So I'm going to give that a little squirt. We're going to make sure all this stuff is tight. The jacks weren't really tight before on the other one. I might have already done it on this one. I don't even recall. It's always good to check. Yeah, I already tightened these. So I'm just going to change out this slightly microphonic preamp tube, unless it's some new old stock thing that was specifically chosen despite the microphonics. It is a JJ, so I will return this along with the two ARS generic Chinese EL84s, and let's put a better preamp tube in there than that JJ. There's nothing wrong with the JJ as far as the brand goes. That particular one, there's just got a little bit of microphonics to it. Let's see what I have handy. I've got some TAD 2-amp Dr. 7025s that came in just before the tube crisis hit. Microphonics are gone. That sounds pretty good. All right, I think this amp is healthy. I'm gonna let it run for a little bit longer since I did change to 3 tubes and 3 resistors. And I wanna see what's up with those input jacks real quick. That can be noise from my hand. Let's see what happens if I get in here with a plastic tool. All right, it's shunting properly. If I touch the ground, it goes away. It's when I'm almost touching ground that it's noisy. That's just a matter of the chassis being open without the shielding panel on the rear. Let's make sure these screws holding the chassis in place are all tight. They're not. All right, let this run a bit, do some more playing tests, and see if the amp is ready for prime time, as I expect it will be soon.